Everyone has their own favorite childhood video game, and for a lot of 2000s kids, it's probably one of these, which makes sense when you combine Lego bricks, the most popular toy, and video games, one of the most popular forms of media. It makes perfect sense why so many of us got so attached to these games in the first place, and everyone has their own favorite Lego game. A lot of people who played the more recent titles might consider Lego Avengers, DC Villains, and even Lego City to be their favorite ones. However, my three favorite games are some of the oldest, and those are Lego Star Wars, Lego Indiana Jones, and Lego Batman. And while I love all three of these games, there's something about this one in particular that makes it stick out so much in my mind. Maybe it's the bright colors and iconic designs of all the characters, maybe it's the level design or how enjoyable the combat is, or maybe it's just because this is technically the first ever Batman game I even played, but even then I still couldn't quite explain it. So I decided to go back and play through the entire game from start to finish, including both the heroes and villains mode, because I could just give a typical Gen Z response and say that this game defined my childhood, but I don't want to do that. Instead, I want to analyze this game and see how good it actually is all these years later. So to celebrate the release of Legacy of the Dark Knight, I plan on seeing if the first Lego Batman game is still worth playing nearly 18 years later. The story is simple and vague by design. While many older Lego games have simple and vague ways of storytelling, it's even more noticeable here, as unlike other games such as Lego Star Wars and Indiana Jones, the story and cutscenes aren't based on any source material like the movies or even the TV shows, although many of the characters' designs come straight from the animated series, but that's as far as it goes. Because of this, the plot is even more vague than usual, but it doesn't really matter since we don't need much context behind what we're actually doing, especially when this is before they had any actual dialogue. But given how the game is structured, you don't really even need to understand the story, so while it is basic, it doesn't really need to be anything more than that. So after the first level with Clayface, we now have the choice between three different sets of missions. These three options are Team Riddler, Team Penguin, and Team Joker, with every single one of them having their own tone and atmosphere. The Riddler's missions have much more consistent colors while having a good balance of both colors that stand out and ones that don't. These levels have a very standard tone that you would expect to see somewhere in Gotham City. These missions don't always have the most colorful designs, but they don't need that. It's the same as when any platformer decides to have a more basic looking first world before showing off the more unique set pieces and visuals later on. Penguin's missions use darker colors to set the tone as more mysterious and gloomy. Although one or two of Riddler's missions already looked like this, Penguin's missions rely just a little bit more on these colors. Joker's missions use the brightest colors, with them also being the main focus in a few areas. These levels don't even feel like they're in Gotham, but that's not a bad thing. With how dark and gray the first two sets of missions were, it's good to get some visual variety. And as for the villains you fight, they all fit the tone of their respective teams. Riddler's team feels the most normal, for a lack of a better word, with a more human-like cast of characters such as Riddler, Two-Face, and Mr. Freeze. Penguin's team has most of their individual levels taking place in much darker parts of Gotham, like the rooftops above or in the Gotham sewer lines below. Here, the villains very much feel like the ones that could be considered outsiders, as you wouldn't expect people like Catwoman, Penguin, Man-Bat, or Killer Croc to be roaming the streets of Gotham in broad daylight. Then Joker's team feels like the least human out of all three. People like Scarecrow and Harley Quinn definitely feel the most extreme compared to who you played against before, which is why it makes sense to have him team up with one of the most consistently chaotic villains in DC history. In terms of the actual gameplay, there are a few differences. While you do have the option to play any three of these sets of missions, it's clear that you're meant to play them in their respective order, as Team Riddler's missions are not only the shortest in length, with a couple of them only being about 10 minutes long, they also have the most simplistic level design in the entire game. For the most part, you'll notice a steady increase in difficulty between these three sets of missions. Keep in mind though that all of these sets of missions are still really easy. The later missions just tend to be a little bit longer and have more complex puzzles. But what is it about this game that I love so much? What I realized after playing is that this game's biggest strength is variety. The different characters, different visuals, and level design, along with the differences in tone and atmosphere between each level, is what gives this game so much life. And one of the main ways that this game adds a bunch of variety to the heroes mode are through the different types of suits that Batman and Robin switch between. While the default suits are great, it's not really enough to carry an entire playthrough, especially when you're only playing as two characters, which is why the game gives both Batman and Robin a bunch of different suits with unique abilities. For Batman, you have the Demolition Suit, Glide Suit, Sonic Suit, and Heat Protection Suit, and for Robin, you have the Tech Suit, Magnet Suit, Track Suit, and Water Suit. While these suits are a nice addition, the game heavily relies on only half of them, as you'll mostly be using the Demolition, Glide, Magnet, and a Track Suit. The other suits, while used in a handful of levels, are extremely underused. This is something you'll notice about halfway through your first playthrough, as you start using the same 4 suits for most levels. I think if they evened out the playtime for each suit, it would really help with the gameplay feeling less repetitive over time. Combat in this game, while basic, is still pretty satisfying. One thing that really helps the combat in this game are the different kinds of animations. enemies. Sometimes you'll have these guys fly back when you hit them, other times you can perform a takedown move or grab people before attacking them, and sometimes they'll just fall over and land on their head. You can use batarangs both for puzzle solving and for combat. While it doesn't fundamentally change how the combat works, all of these different animations based on RNG help a lot with the game's variety that I mentioned before, because if all you could do is just one-shot enemies without there being anything different about each attack, the combat would get old really fast. Although one complaint I do have about the combat is that the enemy spam becomes a serious issue after a couple hours. It's something that becomes more noticeable in later missions, but once you notice it, it's hard not to notice it. Sometimes you'll just have 10 people spawn out of nowhere when you enter a new area, which I think is the game's way of compensating for its lack of challenge. But what about the level design? I don't have much to say about this because they all have pretty good pacing, and the most I can elaborate on this is that they have a good balance between combat and puzzles. Something else I can say about this game is that it just looks incredible. Ignoring all the actual mechanics of the game, this still looks great for a 2008 release. If mechanical variety is what the combat offers, then visual variety is what helps the levels stand out. Many missions have unique set pieces, while not challenging, still help with both variety for gameplay and visuals. Boss fights in this game are kind of inconsistent. Some of them use more puzzle solving and platforming to make the fights more engaging, while other fights don't really have any of that. With how easy this game is overall, the bosses usually need more bells and whistles like puzzles and extra enemies to make the fights more enjoyable, and this works well when they actually do that. The problem is they only do this for 2/3 of the fights. The last third of the fights are so simple that you barely have to think when playing. The main things that the best fights have in common is that they all have a decent mix of combat, puzzle solving, and platforming. They usually have enough going on between actually fighting the villain himself that it doesn't feel too one-dimensional. You'll alternate a lot between fighting henchmen, building things to further progress the fight, fighting the actual boss, and solving puzzles. All of these individually are still really basic, but combining these things makes the fight much more enjoyable. Now, like I said before, about 2/3 of the bosses are actually pretty good, but that last third of the bosses pretty much only rely on one unique attack. The two worst examples for me would have to be Catwoman and Killer Croc. Both of these fights have the same issue of just being enemies with a lot of health while only having one extra move for each of them. For fights like this, it becomes much more time consuming rather than enjoyable, because when you have less mechanical variety, I really need to stop using that word, that's when the game's weak difficulty becomes much more noticeable, which is also when the fights start to feel a lot more repetitive. Now, despite everything I've complained about so far, I still enjoyed playing the vast majority of the hero mode, except for a few specific levels. These are easily what I consider the worst part about the entire game, and those are the vehicle missions. Now hear me out, I don't hate all the vehicle missions, just most of them. Out of the 5 different missions that are in the game, I only enjoyed playing 2 of them, but the ones I hate the most are the 2 levels on water, and that's mostly because of one reason, and that would be the controls. Controlling on water in this game just doesn't work. Driving and flying around work fine for the most part, but once you start using a boat, the controls become insanely frustrating at times, because you can manage with fighting normal enemies and basic maneuvering, but the second you have to drag these stupid bombs around is when the flaws in the game's controls really start getting exposed. Maybe it's just a skill issue on my part, but does this look fun? I really don't know how I beat this as a kid, because dragging around these stupid bombs just for them to get caught by one of these guys or one of these other traps is just as boring as it is frustrating. The other 3 vehicle missions are a lot better but still have some of the same issues. Pretty much every vehicle mission in this game has the same issues of having repetitive and basic level design. Nearly every one of these missions has you grabbing bombs or missiles to shoot down obstacles, and while the one with Two-Face is definitely my favorite, it wasn't nearly as good as most of the levels you play on foot. It definitely was more interesting than the other vehicle missions, considering you had to take down certain types of trucks and deliver them to this guy, along with having much better controls than any of the other vehicle missions, but it still had the same issues with the actual gameplay still being way more basic than the levels on foot. I think an easy fix for this would to give the player more variety in the different objectives. Moving away from the actual missions for a second, I want to talk about the main hub. The Batcave is one of the best hub worlds in any LEGO game to this day. You start out where you can choose between the 3 sets of missions for the hero mode. Over here you got the Bat computer used for buying extra characters, suit upgrades, and data. And if you go to the right of that and pull down on this lever, you are introduced to the entire second half of the game in the villains mode. Here you not only get access to a second hub in Arkham Asylum, but you also gain access to 15 extra missions on top of the original 15 in the hero mode. The Arkham hub world feels way more chaotic when you're actually walking around in it. If you stand around even for a few seconds, a fight will probably break out. All these missions take place right before the hero mode, showing what the villains did right before Batman and Robin stepped in. Other people have pointed out how a lot of games would try to sell this as DLC nowadays, so getting this as a part of the base game with no additional cost is great for the game's replay value. The actual levels work fundamentally the same as the hero missions, with you going through each part with a good mix of combat and puzzle solving. Where these levels change from the hero mode is the much larger cast of characters you play as. The hero mode has you only playing as 2 characters the entire time with suit variants. Here you play as a grand total of 13 different characters, all with unique abilities. Batman and Robin were great for their levels, but the suit variants can only take the game so far, especially when half of them are underused. This mode's main strength is the fact that having this many playable characters makes both the combat and puzzle solving a lot more fun to play, as you won't be limited by what only 2 characters are capable of. A lot of them may share 1 or 2 traits with each other, but most characters have a unique combination of abilities, like how Mr. Freeze can lift heavy objects in the same way as Bane or Killer Croc. He can still do things like this that no other character in the game can do, or how Joker can walk over toxic waste just like these characters, but also has the ability to use generators. And what helps a lot with this second half of the game is you'll pretty much always have at least 1 playable character that was different from the last mission. You'll always have the main villain of each story to play as, with Joker, Penguin, and Riddler being around for each level, but the person they play with changes every time. If you didn't like playing as Clayface in the first mission, you get to switch to Mr. Freeze about 10 minutes later. If you don't like playing as Harley Quinn, then you get to play as Scarecrow right after that. This is huge for both the game's replayability and its pacing. Now, one thing I did notice about the levels compared to the hero mode is just how open they were in comparison. The majority of the hero levels felt much smaller and more condensed. Having open-ended levels like this has its own strengths and weaknesses, but I think it works well here considering how different it is compared to the hero mode, and I don't think this makes the game any worse considering the game still fundamentally plays the same, except that some of the levels are just a little slower paced. So is LEGO Batman a masterpiece? I mean, not really, but it's still good. I won't sit here and act like it's objectively better than most modern LEGO games, but if you like Batman, it's still worth playing at least once. The suit variants in the hero mode, along with the extra characters in the villain mode, stop this game from getting stale after just a couple hours, with all the different characters being unique enough from one another to justify them being in the game. The boss fights do a good job at utilizing all the game's mechanics to compensate for the game's easy difficulty. The game still looks great for a 2008 release. The levels all stand out in their own way, and even the less interesting ones are still enjoyable enough to play through. The combat has enough different weapons and animations to make up for the lack of challenge, so I can still say that despite the flaws, I still love playing this game. Except for the vehicle missions, I still hate those. So if you're like me and haven't played Legacy of the Dark Knight yet and want to play this beforehand, you should, because this game is still unique and a great throwback to the early days of the LEGO game genre. My name is Risky, and I'm gonna go get some Taco Bell.